Thanks to MPB for sponsoring this video. Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and in this video I'll be comparing three 56mm lenses for the Fujifilm X system. From left to right, the Sigma 1.4 DCDN. In the middle, Fujifilm's own updated 1.2 RWR, and on the right, the most recent Viltrox 1.2 Pro. All three deliver short telephoto coverage with the chance for very shallow depth of field effects, and that makes them perfect for portrait photography, but also suitable for many urban and natural landscapes. In this review I'm going to show you how they compare side by side for subjects near and far, as well as their focusing and features, and I'll be testing all three using an X-T5 body to see how they handle Fujifilm's most demanding 40 megapixel sensor. Let's start with age and price. Sigma's 56mm 1.4 DCDN for X mount was launched in early 2022 and costs around $480 or £420. It's actually based on an optical design that came out 4 years earlier in 2018 for Sony and Micro Four Thirds mounts, so it's both the oldest and the cheapest of the three here, but not to mention the most compact, albeit with a dimmer 1.4 aperture. There's also no aperture ring and it's only sealed at the mount. Next comes Fujifilm's XF 56mm f1.2 RWR, launched in late 2022 and costing around $1,200 or £1,000. It's actually Fujifilm's second 56mm 1.2, succeeding an original model that was launched in 2014. This latest version has a new optical design and also includes weather sealing, but it's comfortably the most expensive in this test. The most recent is the Viltrox 56mm f1.2 Pro, launched in September 2025 at a price of $580 or £530. It's the largest of the three lenses here, but it is priced keenly for a 1.2 lens, and Viltrox also offers 5% off if you buy direct from their website, and I've got a link for you right below. Since the Fujifilm and Sigma models are a few years old now, you can also look out for used models at lower prices from MPB, the sponsor of this video. For instance, MPB had Fujifilm's latest 56 1.2 RWR in excellent condition for around 3/4 the price of new, or the original model for around 1/3 the price. Sure, the newer one is better, but I shot with the original model for several years and I always enjoyed the results. Meanwhile, there's also savings to be had on Sigma's 56 1.4 for X mount in light new condition, as well as Fujifilm's XF 50mm f2. Both are great options if compact size is important to you. Now, I've bought and sold used camera gear for many years with MPB, long before they supported my channel here, and I keep returning to them for their honesty and peace of mind. Unlike some marketplaces, MPB is always upfront about the condition of the gear they're selling, showing clear photos from all sides, listing everything that's included, and crucially offering a 12-month warranty as well as a full refund within 14 days if you're not happy. Or if you need to raise some funds, how about selling any gear that you don't use anymore to MPB? You don't need to create a listing or take photos or haggle with anyone. MPB will give you an instant quote, can arrange collection, and will pay you within a few days. So whether you're buying used gear or selling anything that you don't need anymore, check them out at mpb.com or using the link in the description. Right, back to the review. All three of the 56mm lenses that I'm testing here may share the same quoted focal length, but they're quite different sizes. Sigma's is unsurprisingly the most compact with its dimmer f1.4 aperture, but the differences side by side is really quite dramatic. It's noticeably shorter and up to half the weight of the other two. The size difference is also reflected in their respective filter threads, 55mm on the Sigma, but much larger 67mm for both the Fujifilm and Viltrox, thanks of course to their brighter apertures. Features wise, the Sigma is also the simplest model here, with weather sealing only at the mount and no controls other than a manual focusing ring. Now, many Fujifilm owners do like to have aperture rings, so this is definitely a downside to owning the Sigma. In contrast, both the Fujifilm and Viltrox lenses sport aperture rings and weather sealing, but there's no getting away from the size of that Viltrox lens. Quick observation, if you shake the Viltrox lens when it's dismounted or with the power off to your camera, you will feel some elements moving inside, probably a floating focus mechanism. This is normal behaviour, so don't worry. All three lenses are also supplied with lens hoods. Here's the Sigma, followed by the Fujifilm, and finally here's the Viltrox. Interestingly, the Viltrox opts for a petal rather than cylindrical design. Now for my first test, and again all were performed using a Fujifilm X-T5 body, starting with focusing on the Sigma 56 1.4, wide open at 1.4 and in single AF mode with the autofocus area in the middle. Here the Sigma lens takes just under 1 second to pull focus between the bottle and the wall, and you can see the magnification varying due to focus breathing. Next, for the Fujifilm XF 56 1.2 RWR at 1.2, where it's actually looking quite similar to the Sigma in focusing speed, maybe a tad faster, but not enough to make a significant difference. Here too you can see evidence of focus breathing with a change in magnification. And now for the Viltrox 56 1.2 Pro at 1.2, and apologies for ironically not being properly focused on the camera screen when I was recording this clip, but you should still see that the Viltrox lens is visibly faster at focusing than the other two models, even if you take an occasional wobble en route into consideration. You'll also see less evidence of focus breathing here. Next for coverage, and hear me out, as while all three are described as having a 56mm focal length, they may actually deliver slightly different fields of view in practice. So here's the Sigma 56, followed by the Fujifilm 56, which is capturing a fractionally wider field of view here, and finally the Viltrox 56, which looks very close to the Sigma at this distance. So the Sigma and Viltrox are almost identical in coverage, at least when focused on a very distant subject, while the Fujifilm works out a tad wider. Note these were all taken with their respective lens profiles applied, as that's how they're designed to be used. When disabling them purely out of curiosity though, the Fujifilm and Viltrox models looked almost unchanged, whereas the Sigma was a tad wider to start with than before, with a little bit of pincushion distortion too. Not much, to be fair, but certainly a little bit more than the other two were showing. So clearly the Sigma lens is relying on profiles more than the other two lenses. So now let's see if that has any impact on quality as I angle the pier so that details run into the corners. You're looking at the Fujifilm XF 56 1.2 RWR here at 1.2, and as I zoom into the middle for a closer look, I'll place the Sigma 56 1.4 DCDN on the left at 1.4, and the Viltrox 56 1.2 Pro on the right at 1.2. I've enlarged them all by the same amount here, so remember the Fujifilm magnification is going to be fractionally lower due to its slightly wider coverage. With all three lenses set to their maximum apertures, it's clear that the Sigma on the left is delivering the least sharp results in the middle, and this is at 1.4 versus 1.2 on the other lenses. Meanwhile, the Fujifilm and Viltrox crops are looking similar, but I'd say the Viltrox is a tad high contrast. Close the Fujifilm and Viltrox lenses to 1.4 to match the aperture of the Sigma, and both barely change, indicating they were already operating close to their best quality when wide open. If anything, the Fujifilm in the middle has caught up to the Viltrox though. Close all three lenses to f2, and again there's barely any difference from the Fujifilm and Viltrox models, although there is a notable improvement from the Sigma on the left, now looking much better than before, albeit still lacking the ultimate crispness of the other two. Close one stop further to f2.8, and again the Fujifilm and Viltrox models barely change, while the Sigma steadily improves. By f4, I'd say all three lenses are looking almost identical in the middle. Sure, the Viltrox and Fujifilm enjoy fractionally crisper details and fractionally high contrast, but it's so close at this point you'll barely notice. So let's return to the Fujifilm sample at 1.2 before heading into the far corner. I'll once again place the Sigma on the left and the Viltrox on the right, all at their maximum apertures. Here you can see more obvious differences between the three lenses. The Fujifilm in the middle is by far the sharpest in the corner when the apertures are wide open, followed by the Viltrox, which is a little softer but much darker due to vignetting, and that leaves the Sigma in third place, looking soft when wide open. Close the Fujifilm and Viltrox to 1.4 to match the Sigma, and the Viltrox already begins to lose some of that vignette, but the Fujifilm sample remains ahead overall. Closed f2, the Fujifilm in the middle remains in the lead, but the Viltrox is steadily improving, and the Sigma, as seen earlier, enjoys a boost too. At f2.8, the Sigma on the left improves even further and comes closer to the result from the Viltrox, even looking better in some, but not all respects. Meanwhile, the vignette on the Viltrox is steadily improving, although there's still some evidence of coloured fringing in areas of high contrast. To be fair though, both of these artifacts do respond well to correction on RAW files. With them all set to f4, they're all delivering a great looking result in the corner. The Sigma now essentially matches the others in sharpness, and the Viltrox has effectively eliminated the vignette and that coloured fringing. Maybe the Fujifilm in the middle still enjoys a fractional lead at this point, but the others have essentially caught up. But don't forget, the Fujifilm lens was already looking almost this sharp in the corners with its aperture wide open, so you're going to have to think carefully about how important that is for you. Next for portraits, the bread and butter of short telephoto prime lenses, and here it's as much about the rendering of the background blur as it is about sharp focus details. All of the following images were taken at the maximum aperture of each lens and from the same shooting distance. I'll cycle through them all first, starting with the Sigma at 1.4. Next for the Fujifilm at 1.2, whereas before you'll notice a slightly wider field of view, and finally the Viltrox again at 1.2. Now let's put them side by side in the same order, so Sigma on the left, Fujifilm in the middle, and Viltrox on the right, all at their maximum apertures. Here I was expecting a more noticeable difference between their background rendering, but at first glance they're actually looking very close. You would expect larger bokeh blobs from the 1.2 lenses, but here that's being cancelled out to some degree by the slightly narrower field of view from the Sigma, effectively enlarging both the subject and the blobs, and again that's due to the profile. If the subject sizes were matched, rather than the shooting distance, you'd see slightly smaller blobs from the Sigma. Look really closely and you may also see some evidence for this with some of the 1.2 blobs overlapping more than they do on the 1.4 Sigma. The fall off to blur on the side of my face also happened sooner on the 1.2 samples here, as you'd expect. As for the rendering of the background, I'd say all three share a pretty similar style here with no obvious standouts. If you're being really critical, I'd say the Sigma has slightly harsher bokeh than the others, and that the Fujifilm is arguably the softest, but even side by side it's subtle. As for resolved detail on my face, the Sigma falls behind the other two a little, but is generally less important for this kind of subject. One quick note though, throughout my test with all three lenses, I found the X-T5 metering underexposures when fitted with the Viltrox lens set to 1.2, and this is with them all under the same conditions. Typically 1 to 2/3 stops darker than you'd want it to be. Now this lens was still quite new when I tested it, so perhaps it's an early compatibility issue, or maybe a problem with the profile, or perhaps more likely the very strong vignette that this lens delivers at f1.2 could be fooling the metering system in some way. Either way, if you buy this lens and you're experiencing the same issue that I did at 1.2 and your pictures are looking a bit dark, then you may need to apply say 1/3 or 2/3 of positive exposure compensation just to make up for that. Note that as soon as I started closing the aperture though, there was no issue with the metering, it's only at f1.2. Let's now take a closer look at rendering with my bokeh ball test, again with all three lenses from the same distance. And as before, I'll cycle through the images starting with the Sigma at 1.4, followed by the Fujifilm at 1.2, and finally the Viltrox at 1.2, and here I've had to apply 2/3 EV compensation to this lens to match the brightness of the others when they're wide open. Now let's place them side by side with the Sigma on the left, the Fujifilm in the middle, and the Viltrox on the right, all at their maximum apertures, and the first good news is all three are managing to avoid any obvious outlining or onion ring textures on their bokeh blobs. Comparing the shapes towards the corners, all three also exhibit the elongated cat's eye effect at their maximum apertures. So let's first stop the f1.2 lenses down to 1.4 to match the Sigma. Here the Sigma and Fujifilm blobs are looking a little rounder, but there's not a lot in it. So now here they all are at f2, where the Fujifilm lens in the middle is already delivering almost round blobs across the frame, while the other two flanking it still have some sawn off blobs towards the extremes. At f2.8, all three lenses are now rendering more consistent shapes across their frames, but those actual shapes are looking a bit different between them. There's greater evidence of the geometric shape from their respective diaphragm systems, most obviously from the Sigma's 9-bladed system on the left, followed closely by the Viltrox on the right, while the Fujifilm remains more rounded. Note Fujifilm and Viltrox both employ an 11-bladed system in their lenses here, but Fujifilm's is staying more rounded in shape. At f4, the diaphragm shapes become more obvious, again more so from the Sigma, followed by the Viltrox, and again with Fujifilm taking a small lead. Now there's no right or wrong result here, just the effect that you personally prefer. So, based on these and my portrait tests, do you yet have a leader in terms of rendering? And finally, while we're talking about close-ups, I positioned each lens as close as they could manually focus on a ruler to measure their reproduction. All three lenses may quote the same focal length, field of view, and 50cm closest focusing distances, but differences in actual focal lengths, profile corrections, and focus breathing can all deliver variations in overall magnification. So let's see how they look. Let's first run through them, starting with the Sigma, followed by the Fujifilm, and finally the Viltrox, and here they're all set to f4. Now let's position them in horizontal strips with the Sigma at the top, the Fujifilm in the middle, and the Viltrox at the bottom. Here you can see the Sigma delivering greater magnification, followed by the Viltrox and finally the Fujifilm. Look closer at the edges though and you'll notice the Viltrox is softer at the extremes when all are set to f4. Switch these for versions at their maximum apertures and you can see the Fujifilm remaining impressively sharp, right up to the edges even at f1.2 and from its closest focusing distance, while the Sigma and especially the Viltrox have become noticeably softer. But in the middle of the frame they are much closer in sharpness. Okay, so that's all of my tests presented and compared, so what have we learned so far and which one's going to be best for you? In terms of focus speed and focus breathing, the Viltrox 56 1.2 Pro was an early leader, swifter than the others and almost bereft of changes in magnification due to breathing. In terms of optical sharpness at their maximum apertures, the Fujifilm and Viltrox were essentially neck and neck for subjects in the middle of the frame, both visibly crisper than the Sigma, or at least my sample of the Sigma. But as you move into the corners, the Fujifilm maintained this sharpness for an overall lead regardless of subject distance. In contrast, the Viltrox became a little bit softer in the corners and suffered from a much more pronounced vignetting effect. But as you close the apertures, the Sigma began to gradually sharpen up and the Viltrox quickly lost its corner deficiencies until by f4 they were all looking quite similar. In terms of rendering and bokeh, both of the 1.2 lenses could deliver bigger blobs when the subject's size was matched, and slightly softer effects that looked a little less busy, but in both my portrait and bokeh board tests, all three were actually closer than you might expect. Overall, the Fujifilm 56 1.2R WR is the winner overall in optical quality, given its consistently sharp results across the frame and across distances too, from infinity to the closest. It also boasted the nicest rendering, albeit again by a smaller margin. Now if you intend to shoot at 1.2 most of the time and you value sharpness right into those corners, I'd say it's worth investing the extra. And previously the Sigma would have come a worthy second place, but its aging optical design has now been outclassed by the considerably newer Viltrox for very little extra money. Sure, it's not perfect, the Viltrox is nowhere near as good as the Fujifilm in the corners when both were at 1.2, but crucially for subjects near the middle they are very close and also share similar overall rendering styles. Plus in its favour the Viltrox focused faster most of the time and suffered from less breathing too. It may be the largest and the heaviest of the three lenses here, and you may need to watch out for metering underexposures when wide open at 1.2, but there's no denying that it represents excellent value for money at almost half the price of the Fujifilm. Meanwhile, when faced with modern rivals with superior optics, the major selling point of the Sigma is being satisfyingly light and compact. It's physically a much better match for Fujifilm's smaller or indeed lower resolution bodies, plus in many of my tests it did come close to the other lenses, especially when stopped down. That said, I do feel this particular Sigma lens is overdue a redesign, which could also include an aperture ring. Certainly if you're considering it based on size and are happy to stock down to f2 for the best results, then I reckon you'll probably be better off right now with Fujifilm's own XF 50mm f2 RWR for much the same money. And if you're interested in that lens, I've got another comparison video that includes the XF 50 f2 against the original 56 1.2 and the huge 50mm f1.0. There's certainly no shortage of lenses around this focal length in the X system. Anyway, that's what I think. What about you? If I've missed out one of your favourites around the 50mm focal length, do let me know in the comments. Plus, I'd also love to know which of the three 56 lenses that I tested is your overall favourite here. Thanks as always for watching, and thanks also to MPB for sponsoring this video. If you've got any used camera gear to buy, sell or trade, check them out at mpb.com or using the links below. See you next time. Bye bye.